Sound check. Good evening. It is a pleasure to be here this evening to join all of you, students, faculty, and distinguished guests, for this very special session of the President's Spouse. My name is Francine Zorn-Trachtenberg, and in my capacity as the spouse of the President of the George Washington University, I have the honor to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Since the inauguration of President Clinton in January 1992, Hillary Rodham Clinton has been a frequent visitor to the George Washington University campus. Over a year ago, Mrs. Clinton spoke to a group of state and municipal legislators about the administration's health care reform plan. This fall, she addressed the GW campus medical community in recognition of National Primary Care Day. And that was the very same week she accompanied Mrs. Yeltsin to campus to celebrate music with Van Cliburn. Last May, our graduating students witnessed Mrs. Clinton receiving an honorary Doctor of Public Service degree at GW's graduation exercises and heard her deliver remarks at the commencement ceremonies held on the Ellipse, the Clintons' backyard. The honorary degree was granted in recognition of Mrs. Clinton's many years of commitment to public life, which, as we all know, began long before she came to Washington. For 12 years, Hillary Clinton was the First Lady of Arkansas. In that capacity, she won great respect for her efforts on behalf of children and families. She chaired the Arkansas Education Standards Committee. She founded the Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families, served on the board of the Children's Hospital, and pioneered a new program called Arkansas Home Instruction Program, an enterprise that trains parents to work with their children in preschool preparedness and literacy. On the national front, she was a member of the board of Marion Wright Edelman's Children Defense Fund, based here in Washington. During those hectic years, Hillary Rodham Clinton also found time to work as a full-time partner of a law firm, manage and oversee an official residence, and care for her family. Activities accomplished through a balancing act all too familiar to many women here tonight. She has brought that gift of balance to the White House. Not only has Mrs. Clinton taken on critically important civic responsibilities, most visibly as head of the Healthcare Task Force, but she has also gracefully fulfilled traditional First Lady social, hostess, and entertainment responsibilities. As she travels across the nation and around the globe, Hillary Clinton represents this administration and the American people with energy and eloquence. Hillary and President Clinton came to the White House with one of the most ambitious agendas of our lifetime, a commitment to and a vision of a better America. They have never wavered, despite an immense amount of personal and professional criticism, demonstrating, perhaps, that change is one of the most traumatic experiences that a nation can undergo. People prefer the devil they know to the angel they don't, and will remain loyal to the status quo ante, avoiding risk, even when the potential gain is quite extraordinary. In the face of all this, Hillary Clinton has put aside the safe choices in an effort to stake out a 21st century that will be a fairer and better place for all Americans. On behalf of the George Washington University community, it is a tremendous pleasure and an honor to host this evening a woman of remarkable achievement, a woman of many talents, whose intelligence, spirit, and dedication I greatly admire. And now, before we greet the First Lady of the United States, please welcome your instructor, Carl Sferrazza Anthony.
She refused to talk to the press and protected her only daughter, her only child, a teenager, from public exposure. She also advised her husband to drop the atomic bomb. Her name was Bess Truman. She always used her maiden name, worked full-time, managed the family investments, and declared that a day would come in America when husbands and wives both worked, and that it would be no shame if the wife was the breadwinner. Her name, Florence Kling Harding. She believed that women should be provided with as thorough an education as men, and were discriminated against by state and federal law, and would eventually organize to demand equality. More partisan than her husband, the other political party parodied her as Mrs. President. That was 197 years ago. It was Abigail Adams. She advised her husband on cabinet appointments and dismissals, and when scandal threatened to engulf his presidency, she worked behind the scenes to go public with everything and move on. Remember Nancy Reagan? She was appointed by the president to head an official task force, testified before Congress, and it took 3 long years before her Mental Health Systems Act became law. Rosalind Carter saw it through. Congress finally passed Ellen Wilson's Alley Dwelling Act when she was only on her deathbed. Sarah Polk, sought out for her views by House and Senate leaders, kept her office in the president's executive suite. Earning the highest level of education for a first lady at that time, Lucy Hayes was hailed as a symbol of the new woman. All of which should prove one thing. Intelligent and active first ladies, besides Eleanor Roosevelt, are as part of as rich and ancient an American tradition as Independence Day. The current First Lady is not Eleanor Roosevelt incarnate, or Abigail Adams, or anybody else. She is, like all before her, a distinct individual. She is Hillary Rodham Clinton. Today, it is swifter and slicker to sell something by labeling people with one characteristic, then forever typecast them in that caricature. If some other facet of who they really are emerges but doesn't conform to the cliché, it is usually ignored. Every one of us can be categorized by labels: race, religion, gender, income, education, age, political affiliation, hair color. But everyone demands the right not to be reduced to a label. It is the unique combination of everyone's list of labels that shapes them as a distinct individual. Hillary Clinton has many labels: Midwestern, born after World War II, college-educated, traditional Methodist, wife and mother, lawyer, public interest advocate, hostess, only daughter, eldest child, blonde. And it takes less effort to reduce her, uncomplicated, by one or another label, but never all of them at the same time. In most cases, the exploitation of Mrs. Clinton as a symbol by liberal sycophants and conservative hate-mongers alike not only distorts but obliterates who she is as a full person. While she set precedents that have followed precedents that were set by her predecessors, there truly has never been a president's spouse with Mrs. Clinton's background and experience. She is the first First Lady born in that new generation that did not know Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president as a young woman. Remember, the gap between her and the youngest of her predecessors at the time of the Clinton inaugural, Jacqueline Kennedy, was 17 years. She was born in Illinois in 1947, daughter of a conservative Republican, self-employed businessman, raised in a home where the names Roosevelt and Kennedy were not beloved. as she recalls in this month's American Heritage. Her father's influence on her was strong, and in high school in 1964, she was a Goldwater girl, supporting the conservative presidential candidate who ran against LBJ. Although, of course, she did change political parties later, it was the beginning of her political activism. Religion also influenced her. Raised to believe that her social responsibility lay not only within her family circle, but the larger family, her community, she was guided by her Methodist youth counselor to help the disadvantaged, from inner-city Chicago children to the children of Mexican migrant workers. As part of her youth group, she heard Martin Luther King speak in Chicago. His 1968 assassination, said a friend of Hillary's, more than anything, firmed her resolve to do her utmost to stop injustice. She excelled not only in school, but was active in student government, coming of an age at a time when young women were encouraged to pursue the more available choices to them. She graduated from Wellesley in 1969 as college government president, delivering a speech which was covered by Life magazine. At the age of 21 years old, Miss Rodham was a public figure in her own right. The first First Lady to have also earned a graduate degree, she attended Yale Law School, where she met her future husband. After marrying Bill Clinton and moving to Arkansas, she taught law at the State University. As he pursued a political career, she not only played the traditional role of political wife in his campaigns for Attorney General and later governor, but pursued her professional career in law. As the governor's wife from 1979 to 1981, and then again from 1983 to 1993, she assumed multiple tasks, as Mrs. Trachtenberg indicated: chair of the Education Standard Committee, a founder of the Arkansas Home Instruction Program for preschool youngsters, chair of the Children's Defense Fund, full-time hostess in the traditional role of Arkansas's First Lady, and, as of 1980, mother to Chelsea Victoria. Her years as First Lady of Arkansas served her well when she became First Lady of the United States and chose to play a variety of public roles. Within 3 weeks of the inauguration, President Clinton asked her to head his health care task force to draft health care reform. The First Lady became a familiar sight on Capitol Hill, and while improvement of the situation didn't immediately emerge from Congress, Hillary Clinton inaugurated the first full national dialogue in history on the complex problem of health care. And she continues, like many First Ladies before her, to serve as an informal sounding board to her husband. Hillary Clinton has continued the public traditional role begun by Dolly Madison, from christening ships to cutting ribbons to greeting groups in the White House to traveling with the president, planning menus, entertainment, and social events. And like Edith Roosevelt and Lucretia Garfield, she has fiercely guarded time for her teenage daughter in the White House and sought to protect her from the media's glare. And like younger women, Jacqueline Kennedy, Julia Tyler, Frances Cleveland, she is an endless source of fashion speculation. Two of the many labels that can be applied to the First Lady are illustrated in tonight's film clips. The first shows her opening congressional testimony on health care. The second, her press remarks on planning the recent state dinner for Nelson Mandela. We'll go to those now.
During the past months, as I have worked to educate myself about the problems facing our nation and facing American citizens about health care, I have learned a great deal. The official reason I am here today is because I have had that responsibility. But more importantly for me, I'm here as a mother, a wife, a daughter, a sister, a woman. I'm here as an American citizen, concerned about the health of her family and the health of her nation. Like so many Americans, I have seen firsthand the strengths of our healthcare system as well as its frailties. I know what it's like to be overwhelmed with forms and regulations and confusing medical choices when a family member is dying. I know the anguish that comes when it is impossible to weigh choices or make rational decisions, to understand what the government regulations or the insurance fine print might say. I know the frustrations that are felt when judgments about health care too often seem divorced from common sense and human experience. I know from my own experiences and from the conversations I've been privileged to have with thousands of our fellow citizens across this country that something is wrong with our healthcare system and that it needs to be fixed. I realize that we all have our own perspectives on how to solve the healthcare crisis. Each of us brings our own personal perspective to this issue. As you can see, we are having dinner in the East Room instead of the dining room because I like to eat in different parts of the house as well as outside and do something different with various functions, and also because of the numbers of people who will be attending this evening. And we are especially excited about doing this because it's the first time we have served a sit-down dinner in the East Room. We've used the East Room for buffets, and we've used the room for a new format we're using a lot with private dinners, which is dinner in the dining room and then dancing and dessert here in the East Room, which works very well.
Advisor, hostess, mother, she can be described by any label to serve any purpose. Perhaps the wisdom of her predecessor is best remembered. After trying to define herself as a social liberal but fiscal conservative, Barbara Bush finally declared, "Labels are for soup cans, not for people." So let us permit her to speak for herself. Join me in welcoming First Lady Hillary Rodham Clinton. Mrs. Clinton, I'm going to start by asking you the question I've asked all the other First Ladies who have joined us on 3 previous evenings about their husbands. Could Bill Clinton have been elected president without you?
Well, it wouldn't have been as much fun, I don't think. I think he could have and would have done whatever he chose to do in his life. But I just can't imagine my life without him, and I can't really imagine his without me, so I can't answer the question other than to say that we've been together for so long and have gone through so much together and now find ourselves in this extraordinary position. But I'm often asked by children, what's it like being married to the president? And I always say, I can only tell you what it's like being married to Bill Clinton, and that's wonderful. And he happened to turn out to be president, which when I moved to Arkansas was not in the cards by any stretch of the imagination.
If he had decided not to go into politics, or if perchance you hadn't met at school, thinking back before you met him, do you think you yourself might have pursued a political career?
Probably not in elective office. I think that there are so many ways to serve, and I would be involved in my community wherever that was, and I would be, I hope, working on issues that I care about. no matter where I was. But I don't know that I would have pursued an elective, no.
Tell us about Bill Clinton, perhaps in a way that we don't know, and why it is that you married him. And we know that you shared great...
We're just here together. This doesn't leave this room, right?
I mean, you had many shared interests, and you had many pursuits that you both shared. But as a person, we've never heard you talk about that.
Well, sort of dredge up ancient history, all of you who've been married for a while and can think back. I remember very clearly, I've told this story before, that I first had an impression of Bill Clinton when I was cutting through the little area at Yale Law School that kept all the vending machines, which is basically how I survived in those days, you know, and I was going to get something to drink, and I was rushing through, and I heard this voice say, "And not only that, we grow the biggest watermelons in the world." And I turned to a friend of mine and I said, "Who is that?" And she said, "That's Bill Clinton. He's from Arkansas, and that's all he talks about." So I thought, well, that's interesting. I'd never met anybody from Arkansas. And so I didn't really know him. I just saw him. And we would run into each other in the hallway. And I thought he was attractive and had kind of a sparkle in his eye. But I never really met him. And we ended up in a class together, the second semester of that second year of my law school career, and his first year, because he had gone from Georgetown to Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar, and I'd gone right from Wellesley. So we were in this class, and he likes to say that we did not attend, either of us, as frequently as we should have. But at some point, we actually did encounter one another, and, you know, sort of said hello, but still didn't meet each other. But the more I saw him, the more intrigued I was by him, because he seemed to be unlike a lot of our friends at the law school. He was actually friendly. He talked to people. He inquired about you. He said, "How are you feeling?" And most of the rest of us, and I include myself, you know, we're pretty uptight trying to figure out how to read all this stuff and learn it and everything. And Bill always had time for people. And friends of mine began saying, "You know, this fellow is so nice, I needed notes," and he gave me his notes. He asked about my mother, who had an operation, and it was just very unusual in that atmosphere. And so one day I was not really sticking. It was going in one ear and out the other. And he was standing out in the hallway, and I don't know, you know those moments, you know, sort of like click, you know, and I was sitting there and I just started staring at him, and I just began to look at him, and I thought, you know, I really like the way he looks. I need to get to know him. And then he caught my eye and he began staring back at me, and so here I am in the library not reading. Here he is actually surrounded by people who are talking at him, not talking back. So finally I thought, this is ridiculous. You know, I'm in this class with this person. And so I put my books down and I went up and I said, you know, if you're going to keep looking at me and I'm going to keep looking at you, we ought to at least know each other's names. I'm Hillary Rodham. Who are you? And he says that he couldn't remember his name. That makes me feel so good when he says that. But anyway, he did sort of stumble out, "I'm Bill Clinton." Well, you know, then, you really want me to go on about this? I mean, this is, then we ended up, and it was the last day of class, this class that we hardly ever went to, but occasionally saw each other in, and we both showed up for the last day. And so I was walking out the door, and he kind of got to the door at the same time. He said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to go register for my classes next year." He said, oh, I need to do that. And I said, "Okay." So we walked together, and we stood in this endless line, you know, registrars, endless lines. And we talked and talked and talked, and I finally got up to the line. And the registrar, this wonderful woman who I've kept in touch with, Gloria McHugh, said, "Well, Hillary, what are you going to take?" And I started to fill it out, and then she looked at me and said, "Bill, why are you here? You registered yesterday." So I thought, oh, this is very interesting. So I finished registering, and then we went for a walk, and because I had to go get my mail. So we walked to the post office, and then we just kept walking and talking, and we ended up at the Yale Art Gallery.
And he said, I really want to show you this exhibit, this Rothko exhibit, and have you seen it? And I said, no. And he said, well, let's go in. And we got there, and we'd forgotten that Yale was on strike. In those days, everybody was always on strike, for those of you who are not of my vintage. And so Yale employees were on strike, and the art gallery was closed. Nobody could get in. So Bill went up to the man who was on guard there, and he said, is there any way we can get in? I'd really like to show my friend this exhibit. And the security guard said, no, it's closed because they're on strike. And so Bill said, well, could we do something for you, like pick up the trash? And I don't want to offend anybody that we were sort of breaking the strike, but he said, can we do something to kind of get in? And the man said, well, if you pick up all this trash that's just been lying here. So there I am, picking up trash. We picked it up, and that was our first date at the Yale Art Gallery. So.
Moving to and looking at your relationship today.
There's more, but I'll keep that to myself.
Well, when we look at you and the president today in the White House, and we're always hearing constant speculation, as we did about Mrs. Reagan and Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Carter, about your power. What kind of a professional working relationship do you have with the president? What kind of issues do you advise him on? Those that you're just interested in, or all across the board? Personnel, foreign policy? What kinds of things do you weigh in on?
Well, I know that this is a constant interest to people, and goes back really, I suppose, all the way to Martha Washington. What does the president talk about to his wife? And I guess the first thing I'd say is that, like most husbands, you talk about what is natural to talk about between a husband and a wife. And some couples, I suppose, are more involved with each other than others. But for us, we started talking that day on that walk to the art gallery, and we never stopped. And we just talk about all kinds of things. But he usually talks to me about issues that I have some interest in, or that he is maybe mulling over and wants to get another opinion. Of course, people who know my husband know that he asks opinions from everybody. I mean, he is really open to that. He wants to know what people think. And so it is not as unusual, perhaps, with him, because he's one of the most intellectually curious people I've ever known. And then we talk about matters that he's asked me to work on and discuss those. So it's a kind of rolling, continuing conversation in our house.
When you disagree with him philosophically on the approach to a problem, or the way the administration might approach an issue, is that something that you primarily keep between the two of you?
Yes. Well, absolutely. I cannot say that I agree with my husband on everything, but I will never tell you what I disagree with him about. I don't think that is anything that really goes beyond the two of us. I'm lucky because I rarely disagree with him on what he's doing and what his beliefs are, but obviously we're two different people, so there are such occasions. But I am very supportive of what he's trying to do, what he believes in. I'm very proud of him. I'm proud of the kind of person he is and what he cares about, and how willing he is to keep trying to do what he believes in. And so for me, it's a real pleasure being part of that with him.
How do you deal with so much of the speculation, which seems increasingly, it seems to have we discussed in class, it started after Watergate when the Fords were in the White House, and it's only continued to snowball through the Reagans, through the Bushes, and certainly culminating during the Clinton administration. Speculation about private life and relationships between husband and wife, and then, of course, the newspaper that said you were pregnant with an alien baby. How do you cope with the funny, but also obviously very hurtful?
That is, one of the challenges that is very hard. Anyone who is in public life today at any level, I think, knows how The rules have changed, the standards have changed. It's unclear really what is expected of you in many instances. And certainly at the presidential level, I think it is just astonishing to me, the kind of speculation and the attacks and the criticism. Years and years ago, when I realized that Bill was going to be in public life, I went through a period of being amazed by the kinds of things that I read, and this was at a much kinder and gentler level than what we've seen recently, because I would go to an event and I would see it with my own eyes, and that's not the way it would be portrayed, and I was just really kind of troubled by how to work all of this out. And for me, I try to take such matters seriously, but not personally. And I think that is the best way I can describe how I try to deal with it. Now, I don't always succeed. I mean, sometimes things are just beyond the pale and your breath is taken away. But I will say that if the alien baby comes, we're ready. And looking forward to it. You know, I've always wanted a sibling for Chelsea. I mean, I'm not sure I'd know exactly how to take care of an alien, but I'd sure try to learn. So.
What do you think people, as you've traveled across the country and you've met so many people, both you've met the protests and the critics, and you've met the people who really admire you and look up to you, what do you think people want in their First Lady, the American people want in their First Lady?
You know, there may be 250 million answers to that. Some people, the First Lady may never cross their mind, and so they don't want anything, you know. Bless those people wherever they are. I'm all for them. And then, you know, there are others who have different ideas about the role, have different conceptions of women's role, bring their own personal experience or beliefs to the interpretation of the role. So I don't really know that there is any one answer to that question, which in a way may be a blessing, because I think that every person who has been in this position has had to try to define it for herself and to try to make it work for herself and her husband and her family. And almost no matter what she has done, she's been criticized. And so after a while, you just have to say, I'm going to do the best I can and live my life as I think is the right for me and my family, and then just go on from there.
Do you think that the American people will ever accept the idea of a presidential spouse, male or female, just sort of announcing after the election that I will play no official role, I will live in the White House and appear only on state occasions, but otherwise I'm going to continue working at what I do, obviously if it's something that's not a conflict of interest? Do you think that is ever a possibility?
Oh, perhaps sometime in the future. And the reason I say that is I have watched the role of a governor's spouse evolve. Because when my husband was first elected, it was very unusual for any one of us to do anything other than to be a full-time First Lady of our state, and I decided I was going to continue working, and that was quite unique at the time. Now there have been many governor's spouses, men and women, who have continued their careers, who have pursued their own interests, and it has taken, I think, some adjusting, but I never hear it as an issue anymore. I often used to say when we were out on the campaign trail during the presidential election, and I would be asked, well, you know, what are you going to do and how are you going to do it? Whether they had asked their governor's spouse that question lately. And it was a question of the 1970s and the early 80s. It is not so much a question of the 90s. So perhaps this role as well will evolve.
Do you think, in a sense, that you may be sort of a trailblazer? I mean, when we look at people or the press, and in one case, the man himself lining up for the Republican nomination for president in '96, and we see Lynn Cheney, who'd been chairman of Arts and of the Humanities, Marilyn Quayle, who was a very active vice president's wife, Mrs. Graham, Wendy Graham, who was chair of Commodities and Futures, Elizabeth Dole, who was in the cabinet under Reagan and Bush. Do you think this, at this point now, the whole process of looking into people's professional backgrounds, questioning how much influence they have, what kind of a role they're going to take, in a way, do you think you've suffered for all those men and women and future generations who would follow in your position?
Well, I don't know, but I hope that what happens is that each individual person is allowed to make the choices that are right for her and someday for him as we evolve in this. And I think that's really what is the most important point to make, not only about the role of the First Lady, but about women's lives. I mean, part of what we need to do is get beyond stereotypes and allow women, whether they are in a First Lady position or not, to make the choices that are right for them without the stereotyping, without the expectations, because that's really what we all should be trying to achieve.
What is the greatest misconception about Hillary Rodham Clinton?
Well, I don't know. I'm looking out here seeing if I could call on one of my friends to respond to that. I don't know, sometimes I read about myself and I go, ooh, I don't like her at all. You know, it's just hard even to identify yourself in some of the ways that you're portrayed. I know what people say to me. I mean, people will often, in a big crowd, come up and peer into my face, you know, and take me by the shoulders sometime and kind of turn me around and say, you don't look like yourself. Or they sometimes say, you look so much better in person. Or they say, I like this hairdo better than that hairdo. Sometimes they bring pictures of my hairdos and tell me the ones they like better than the other ones. You know, so it's sort of hard to know what people are thinking about you at any particular time. So I just kind of say thank you. Thank you. I mean, you know, I don't know quite how to relate to that. But I'm sure there are as many misconceptions as there could be because, you know, any one of us in this kind of a role is filtered through so many people's perceptions, and there's always a little bit of an angle on how you're viewed and how you're portrayed, and I think it's very difficult for people who will never meet you in person to get anything like a realistic composite of who you are, because, you know, I listened to what Fran said and what you said in talking about all the other First Ladies. In order to interpret you to the public at large, people have to grab onto something. So you are a fill in the blank. And once you are a fill in the blank, then it's hard to get the rest of the blanks filled in. And there's not a woman in this room who is not many things. And part of what we are all trying to do is keep it together. Some days that's easier than other days, but we are all these things at one time. And so I suppose the misconceptions are the fill in the blanks. Well, I know all about Hillary Clinton. She is a fill in the blank. And, you know, it's difficult for people to either see you or understand you in the many different roles that you play in your life. And I guess think about your own lives, those of you in this room. I mean, if somebody took a snapshot of you, you know, running out the door, going somewhere, they would think differently of you than if you were sitting down at your dinner table with your family. They would think differently of you if they saw you at work or in your community volunteer roles, and on and on.
But what about, what do you think, perhaps this is another way of asking, what do you think in terms of the reaction you get from people when you meet them in the mail, you symbolize to the people at large? Or are you many things to many people?
Well, again, probably. I mean, we get such wonderful letters from people, and I have such a great time traveling around the country talking to people. And so sometimes people articulate what they're thinking about me, or whether, you know, sometimes it's critical as well as positive. And so then I get something of an insight into that person. But mostly I believe that for women today, there are so many options in our lives that can be scary as well as very exciting. And I think women who are challenged and hopeful about those options, whether they are full-time homemakers or whether they are full-time career or whether they, like most of us, are balancing, you know, family and work and all of the responsibilities, they may see me and say, well, you know, this is a woman who's trying to do what I'm doing. And for people who maybe are not as hopeful or as embracing of these new opportunities for women, then the way that I have lived my life and my desire to really pull my life together and to have, you know, the marriage, the motherhood, the opportunity to work, the belief in committing myself to my community, that may seem a little bit off-putting. So I think it's so much as what people see through the lens of their own experience.
What were your own expectations of the role of First Lady, perhaps as a young woman, and then before you got to the White House after the election, and now? And I'm wondering if you could just, has that changed you? I mean, and in what way?
Well, you know, I don't know as a little girl that I had any expectations about First Ladies. We never really saw very much of Mrs. Truman, who was First Lady when I was born, or Mrs. Eisenhower, except, you know, on special occasions. So really, Mrs. Kennedy was the First Lady that just absolutely blasted open our consciousness, and there wasn't anyone like her. I mean, I didn't know anyone at all like her, and we would all just, you know, watch her. And to me, the most extraordinary accomplishment is the way she handled all of those responsibilities at such what I now see as a very young age. Because I know when I was that age, my husband was elected governor, which is a much, much smaller stage by a long shot. And I can remember showing up at the Arkansas governor's mansion and not having a clue about what I was supposed to do. I mean, neither my husband nor I had ever lived in a house that big. We had never had anybody cook our meals. We had never had people there to clean up after us. It was astonishing. And I remember the first night we were there, we walked into the kitchen and we said, "Can we help?" And this woman who'd been the cook, you know, for 30 years looked like we were crazy. And so I had a lot of learning to do at that level, and I saw, you know, Mrs. Kennedy moving into her role with, you know, such grace and just marvelous ability to pull it together. And then, of course, I admired Mrs. Johnson so much because I thought that she had a voice of her own, which she used, and she promoted causes that she cared very much about. And then as, you know, the years went by and I had an opportunity actually to meet some of the women who were in this role, like Mrs. Carter, whom I greatly admired and watched work very hard on behalf of causes she and her husband were committed to, and Mrs. Reagan and Mrs. Bush. I saw the enormous amount of work that it takes to try to do this and to do it in a way that is both in keeping with your own identity and integrity and also fulfilling the responsibilities. And my admiration for these women grew. And then I got interested during the campaign in reading history. And I was so pleased you made some of those references because there's hardly been a first that has happened in the 20th century because so many of the women in the 19th century were there ahead of us.
It was interesting too, and when the president named you to the task force, so many people had sort of forgotten about Rosalind Carter, who was only 15 years before, and she'd been chair of the President's Commission on Mental Health. You talked about Jacqueline Kennedy, and I know during the election and in the last year and a half, you came to know her well, and that one of the things you talked about with her was raising young children in the White House. Your daughter Chelsea has been really essentially led by and large a private life in the White House, which is really unheard of in the latter 20th century. She's now 14, will be 15, I guess, in February. Will we perhaps see her on the '96 campaign trail? Is she, do you think, adjusting to, even to a smaller degree, public life and the public eye?
Well, I think she's adjusted very well, and because she's so well adjusted, you won't see very much of her. I think her feeling is one that her father and I share, and that is that she is going to have, insofar as we are able to provide it, as normal a life as possible. And she does participate in public and other events, but she does so because she's interested in them, and it's not some kind of requirement that we've asked her to fulfill. And I must say that I got a lot of courage for that position from Jackie Kennedy Onassis. I had never met her before the 1992 campaign, and mutual friends of ours had been trying to get us in touch, because I think that when my husband first said he was going to run for president, one of the very first contributions we received was from her. And she had let it be known that she was very interested in him and that she admired him, and we had just never made connection. So I finally had the chance to go and have a very long lunch with her in her apartment in New York. And we sat there and just, I felt like I had known her all my life. I mean, you knew her. I mean, she was marvelous to talk with and so engaging, but she also really encouraged me about how to protect my daughter and gave me a lot of advice about what she had done. And I mean, my daughter will never be subjected to the kind of incredible attention that John and Caroline were over all those years. And I thought to myself, you know, it has been done with such grace, and she's been willing to draw lines. And not just lines about publicity, but lines that are more subtle. I mean, when you're in this position, adults really try to do things for your children, and you have to be very careful about that. And Jackie told me about how she would say to John and Caroline they had to do certain things for themselves, and there were certain obligations that they had, and they had to really be willing to learn the lessons of life. And she told me several stories about John running late to something, or like any young boy not getting all of his books together, and kind of leaving his mother's sight and going and asking a Secret Service agent to maybe take him to school, and she'd find out and she'd say, no, you were late, you're going to have to pay the consequences, you do it yourself. Or having some bullies confront him and take away his bike, and how immediately all of the grown-ups wanted to come to his rescue, and she said, no, you go get your bike back. I mean, it's those things which, if you're not living in the kind of strange circumstances that we live in, you don't have to think about very much with your child. But that's something I've been very conscious of, and tried to make it clear to well-meaning adults that, this is my daughter's life, and she has to be like any other person, making her own decisions. And I really was so grateful for Jackie sharing that.
We are approaching the midpoint of the Clinton administration thus far, and
is that all?
Thus far.
Time flies when you're having fun.
I was wondering if we could just sort of take a forecast of where we are and look into the future, and talk about things like health care and what role. I'm not asking you to look into a crystal ball and predict what will happen, but what role do you think for yourself you will continue or discontinue as far as health care? What about the recent elections and the changes that brought forth? Some comments by Gingrich that you and the president were McGovernites of the 60, out of touch with the normal Americans, and then Senator D'Amato now saying that he's thinking he would like to do whitewater hearings again and this sort of thing. Here you are halfway through the term, how do you sort through all that, deal with that, and look at the future?
Well, I think you have to keep reminding yourself why you're here in the first place. And when my husband decided he was going to run for president, he had a very clear idea about what needed to be done. He wanted to reverse the economic policies of the previous 12 years. He wanted to get the economy growing again. He wanted to deal with the deficit and what it was doing to our futures and our children's future. And he wanted to take on problems that had been neglected, like welfare reform and health care and a lot of the other issues. That's what he did the first 2 years. And he really, I think, will be very highly regarded as we look back on the accomplishments of those first 2 years, which were rather astonishing. collection of legislative achievements. Now, it's also true that you've got to keep the, you've got to keep moving forward. And I think that what brought my husband here and why I was so enthusiastic about what he was trying to achieve is because this wasn't about us. This was about America. This was about people who we knew and cared about and what kind of futures they were going to have. And that's what he's going to keep working on. And if there are ways that we can work together, he's already said this administration has a long list of things. Some say too long, but nevertheless a long list of things that need to be addressed. And if there are ways that he can work with the new majorities, he's going to. And if there are other areas where he disagrees, he will disagree. But this should not be about personalities, and I don't think it should be about sideshows. I think it ought to be about how we work together to help our country move and make a better future for ourselves and our children.
What about the health care, though? You think you will continue to be a voice for health care reform?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the reasons that the President waded into this issue, and there's a lot of history that shows how difficult this issue is. Harry Truman tried 3 times. Every president has tried. And it's extremely complex and controversial. But it needs to be addressed. And the reasons why he addressed it are not going away. They will be with us. And he will continue to work on it, and so will I. I think it's very important to recognize that even though there was not the kind of health care reform adopted that would have dealt with a lot of the cost issues that people are going to face, the shrinking coverage that employers are going to be offering because of cost pressures, the quality issues, particularly in our large hospitals, the cost of the uninsured that are going to be carried by our finest teaching hospitals, on and on. Those problems I'm hearing on a daily basis are back, and they're not going to get better on their own. But now we're going to have to look and see what can be accomplished that perhaps is a more incremental approach to try to deal with the problems that people feel that they have and that they do want some kind of help with. But I'm very optimistic that what we have done for the last 2 years raised this issue to a level of awareness that is going to stay with us, and it will eventually be addressed in ways that people will be comfortable with.
Be able to understand it. And sort of tying a couple of things together when we were talking before about people's reactions to the way you've made choices as First Lady. And I think of the acrimony that certainly occurred, particularly in the final weeks of the health care debate, as well as last year in the winter, the speculation and so forth during Whitewater. Do you believe that had you taken a less public role, in a sense operated like the First Ladies of the 19th century, which was, you know, behind the scenes and then essentially deny it publicly, but if you had been working on it, healthcare behind the scenes, or had taken to the public, shown this just very traditional role, and I don't know anything about anything, and then behind the scenes really been in on the cabinet meetings and so forth, do you think it would have had a different impact in those 2 particular very public issues, Whitewater and the healthcare debate?
Well, I don't know. My husband and friends would probably have had me committed. That would not be at all in my nature and my background. I mean, I, for better or worse, have spoken out on public issues for 25 years and have been deeply identified with issues I care about, and have been on record for many years about issues that are of concern to me. And I think some kind of First Lady amnesia would not have been very credible under the circumstances. Oh, you mean I said that? Oh, well, I can't imagine. I think that it is probably better to be yourself, and it is always a risk, but it is something that I feel very comfortable with, and I am very, very interested in public life and in political issues. I'm one of those kids who, decorated her bike every 4th of July and, read the Constitution out loud with my dad, and, I really care about this country and its government. So for me, if I were at home in Little Rock, Arkansas, or if I had never met Bill Clinton and I had gone home to Chicago, I would be expressing my opinions to my friends and, over coffee or around the water cooler. And I don't see how I could change who I am because of the position I'm in. And I actually think that in the long run, if people have some better idea about you, it may be controversial, but at least they know where you stand. And so that's what I have got to do. I don't really have a choice about that, I don't think.
You mentioned the American character and being interested in so much in government and public service, and I'm wondering if you could sort of comment on the American character and whether that has changed as you've seen it in your life from the 50s through the 60s to the late 60s and the early 70s, if things like violence and bigotry, which seem to be very much in the news all the time now, are part of the American character. In the last election, only 33% of the electorate voted. There's an apathy about government or a lack of understanding of how government really works practically.
Gee, that's such a big question, and I don't know that any one of us could give an adequate answer. I think it's something all of us who care about our country and care about our government ought to be thinking about and talking about. Because I think American history, as you know so well, kind of moves in cycles. I mean, we go through stages and, we move forward in some areas and then we kind of retrench. We have internationalist times, we have isolationist times. I mean, there is so much in the American character that is almost inherently contradictory, but somehow we just always get it together and keep moving along despite whatever the obstacles we face may be. And I think that we're going through one of those periods now. There have been a number of columnists who have written, and my husband has spoken often about how we are at the end of one era. I mean, you can call it the Cold War era, the end of the 20th century, but anytime you move from a period in which, for better or worse, the external conditions were well defined and in effect defined your political life. I mean, growing up in the 1950s, the Cold War and the threat from Russia defined everything. I mean, I can remember those drills where we would march out of our classroom and we'd sit on the floor with our heads up against the locker in the event of a nuclear attack. Really, do you remember that? And I remember, like in probably 6th grade maybe, having our teacher, after Sputnik went up, announce that we had to do better in math because those Russian kids were better than we were. Our whole worldview was defined in that way, and we did a lot of things domestically. We funded education, we built highways, we created the finest higher education system in the world, in part because we had to be strong and defend ourselves against the outside. Now that's gone, and the world is changing, and we're not all sure how it's going to turn out, and some of it is very encouraging. For the first time we don't have Russian missiles facing us as a country, but some of it is very troubling. So where it goes, I don't know.
If there were three sort of changes, if there were three wishes for change for the United States that you had, what would they be?
Oh my, I don't know, Carl. I would wish for very big and idealistic things. I would wish for an end to racism and get that behind us as a country once and for all. Just just end it so we don't have to continue to hassle over it. It takes so much energy. I would wish for a level of, personal satisfaction and opportunity in the lives of all of our citizens, which for some would mean they'd have stable jobs. For others, it would mean they would, find some joy in their family lives that maybe was missing. I mean, obviously, that's highly idealistic, but as I travel the country, people are not always happy with their material success, and we have so much freedom and we have so much affluence, but it doesn't seem enough. It doesn't answer questions, and I would hope that people, maybe through their own spiritual or religious or community efforts would find that. And then I would obviously hope that our children would have the kind of country that many of us in this room took for granted. And we know it wasn't as ideal and as perfect as the sitcoms portrayed it. I watched all of those, and then when they came back on Nickelodeon, I watched them with my daughter, and I mean, because it portrayed us in a way that wasn't realistic, but it was something that we could feel good about. And we all had a common culture. I mean, there were only 3 TV networks. Every time, the Disney show was on and Davy Crockett was on, every kid would walk to school singing Davy Crockett. I mean, there was a culture of America that really bound us together. And for a lot of reasons, that's been splintered apart. And I would hope that we would economically and socially and culturally and politically and spiritually, grow as a nation and really come to grips with who we are and make the commitments to the future that will give our children the kind of country they deserve to inherit. That's what I would hope.
I have one final question, and then we're going to take some audience questions at the 2 microphones. But I'm wondering if, again, you look at healthcare, you look at your involvement in children's programs, and we didn't even get to talk about some of the children's programs, about your own individual and private spirituality, and I know it's something you've begun to talk about a little bit, but it's not something that you talk about openly all the time because it's very private. What would you like your legacy to be? If you, I'm not asking you to write history, but what would you like to leave behind as your mark? That Hillary Rodham Clinton was in this position as the president's spouse, and she left this, fill in the blank.
Oh, my goodness. I hope that in some small way I've helped to contribute to a juster and more fulfilling future for our children. I mean, that is what I care about. It is what gets me up in the morning and keeps me going, because I just think that anything we can do for a child, whether it's your own child, a neighbor's child, a child that you tutor, a child that you visit in the hospital, and what we do on a larger basis to try to remove some of the problems that individual children face, is for me the most important work that any of us can do. And I know that in these days it's not fashionable or politically correct, which now has a new meaning in Washington, to talk about compassion and to talk about mercy and to talk about kindness toward the less fortunate and particularly toward children. But I don't think a nation can be great that turns its back on the poor and the unfortunate and the children among us. And so for me, that's what I would like to work toward.
We will be taking some of the questions now. Our first question here.
Mrs. Clinton, my name is John Costandi. I'm a naturalized citizen. I've been here 25 years. And for the last 25 years, I've been here 30 years. For the last 25 years, I voted Republican. I want to ask you a question that I asked Mrs. Bush before. I'm going to paraphrase the question. I find myself nowadays that I cannot support the Republican radical religious right agenda. I am, though I differ with Mrs. Bush, I'm a social liberal, but a fiscal conservative, very conservative fiscally. Now, I cannot support the radical religious right agenda, but at the same time, I cannot support the Democrat big government economic thinking, like the healthcare program. What can you tell me, or can you tell me anything, something that will encourage me to vote for the Democrats? And another very small question, I would be interested to know at what time or at what moment you have changed personally from being a Goldwater woman to becoming a Democrat. Thank you.
Thank you.
How much time do we have? Well, I would ask you to think about a couple of things. As a fiscal conservative, I hope you appreciate that it was this president's decision to take on the deficit and to do something about spending that reversed 12 years of the most fiscally liberal policies that we had as a nation. The kind of debt that was driven up during the 1980s and the disregard for the deficit and the way it was sucking out investment from the private sector was fiscally irresponsible in the view of this president. And so this president made the hard decisions, cut more than $250 billion in spending, did have to do some raising of taxes among the richest 1.5% to be able to begin to deal with what he inherited. And I think it's unfortunate that that kind of responsible governing was not necessarily understood or appreciated. So I think if you look at what the Democrats, with his leadership, were willing to do to try to deal with the fiscal policies of the past, I think that's a very strong argument. Now, one of the things that we're all going to have to look to see what happens next is, you know, how the relationship between the president and the Congress plays out. And I know that the perception of the health care plan, which I fully accept, was one of big government. I understand that. And obviously I regret it. That was certainly neither the intention nor, from our perspective, what would be the ultimate outcome of what we anticipated, which was negotiation among the various parties. And for a lot of reasons, that negotiation never occurred. But certainly one of the great fiscal issues facing the government is how to control health care costs. Because in the absence of doing so, our budget deficit will once again rise. And we're going to have to confront what we do in order to try to maintain the quality of our health care system with respect to the costs that just this year everyone is very happy have only gone up at 3 times the rate of inflation. And that is an unsustainable cost increase. So there are many things, and I'd be happy to you know, send you information and have somebody talk with you further, because I think that a lot of these labels that are put on the various parties and the positions that they take are really conversation stoppers instead of conversation starters. And I think that we need a very good conversation in our country about what we are going to do together, and not just political slogans, but instead the hard work of solving some of these problems that we face. And as to Senator Goldwater, I'm still a great fan of Senator Goldwater's, and one of the highlights of my year last year was he sent me some chili mix that turned out to be absolutely great. And I've talked to him on the phone. I admire him because, from my perspective growing up, he was a conservative as I understood a conservative from my father. He was not a radical. He was not an extremist. He was not someone who was interested in destruction. He was interested in pulling ideas together and trying to figure out how problems could be solved. And although I would disagree with him on a lot of matters then and now, I admired that because he was willing to stand up for what he believed in, and it was very much rooted in the idea of conserving what is best in our country.
Thank you. Next question.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Ryan, and I just want to start out by saying thank you for being here. And whatever you do, please don't stop the role that you're playing in being yourself and keeping your opinions out. It's been a great source of inspiration, I know, for this entire class for the past 12 weeks, so don't stop. My question is, another thing we've talked about in this class a lot is the if and more likely when a woman president will come in, and I'd like to know your opinion and thoughts about what you think may have to happen before that happens.
Well, I have said, and I believe, that there's a good possibility that sometime in the next 20 years, we will have a woman president. And I say that because I think that there are a number of women who are governors, senators, members of Congress, who are really coming to the forefront and are doing so in ways that will engender national support and national attention. So I think that it's something that I may actually live long enough to see. I hope, and I certainly believe you will. And I hope it's within the next 20 years.
Thank you.
Hi, Mrs. Clinton. My name is Sylvia Yaffe. I first want to tell you that me and my family and all of our friends are very, very strong supporters of you and Bill and have done everything we could to help. Something that I think I see, and my family also agrees, and we don't like it, is that one of the big culprits in persuading the public is the media. The media has taken on such an ugly face. They don't have to tell the truth. They don't have to. It seems that they are backed a lot of times by money. And my question to you is, although it's clear to me and to my friends and associates that Bill has accomplished a lot in these first 2 years, a tremendous amount. He has passed bills that had been wanted for years. He has changed the economy from a failing economy to one that is good. He has done so much in just 2 years, and yet you heard all through this last election campaign nothing was happening in Washington. Deadlock. They blamed deadlock on the Democrats, although it was the Republicans who were the obstructionists. You just heard all negative things, and you didn't hear the truth. And I wonder, maybe I'm naive, but what is it about the publicity that the Clintons have that's not working for them, that's working against them?
I wish I knew. I would be glad to change it. You know, I can't really add to what you've said, and it's a comment that I hear from people all over the country. And you know, I think that the president, if he were here, would have to say that obviously whatever needed to be communicated was not communicated effectively enough. And so that's one of the things that he's really focusing on now, because as he has said, it is absolutely fair game in American politics for people to disagree with what you do. But if they don't know what you do, then the debate is a little off kilter. And I think that he will work very hard to try to make sure that doesn't happen again. Thank you.
The shorter the question, then the more questions we can ask.
Mrs. Clinton, my name is Julie Andrews, and my question for you pertains to your position as First Lady. one thing that has come up in the course is the special influence that you have, whether you want it or not, as First Lady. And I'm curious, as First Lady of Arkansas and First Lady of our country, what you have been able to accomplish with that influence that you're most proud of.
Well, I think that I would have to wait to see what happens during my husband's time in office as president, but certainly from his time as governor, I'm just very excited that I had a chance to work with him on education reform, which has made a real difference in our state, on creating opportunities for children, particularly at an Arkansas Children's Hospital that we spent a lot of time and effort in trying to build up and make as good as we could, in working very hard across the state in creating a different environment in which people were able to make decisions and have opportunities, particularly economically. But I think the education and children's work that we did there is what I personally am most pleased that I had an opportunity to work in.
Good evening. I'm Lynn Garvey Hodge, and Mrs. Clinton, I have a wonderful 14-year-old at home whose name is also Hillary and who has just as much energy as you have. And while many of us in this room have the legacy of Jackie Kennedy, one of the great joys I think that I have is to have my daughter have in her memory bank a legacy of a woman like you who can be a wife, a mother, a professional, and somebody that really cares. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Jo Marie Smith, and my question is, we have witnessed that the role of the First Lady never seems to end, particularly with Rosalind Carter, how she's continuing to help with Habitat for Humanity and all the other issues. Where do you see your role being after President Clinton's second term?
I admire Mrs. Carter so much. Both she and President Carter have continually worked for the causes they believe in, and you cannot be around either one of them without appreciating the effort that they still put in on behalf of people. And I hope that I will have a chance to continue to work on issues that I care about, particularly children's issues, and it'll include health and education issues, which are the two matters that I'm most involved in and that I care so much about. That is after a very long vacation. But I really do want to do everything that I can to, keep attention focused on issues that I think are important to our country and to its future.
And that will be in the next century, right?
Oh, right. Oh, my goodness. That's
2001.
That's incredible, isn't it? I hadn't thought about that.
My name is Joelle Good, and I'm a graduate student here at the American University. I just wanted to let you know I've been here since 12 o'clock waiting for you along with 2 other friends, and it's really been worth the wait. I have 2 quick questions for you. The first one is it difficult to retain your individuality while at the same time serving in the role of First Lady, being a wife of a president, and a mother to your child? And the second question is a yes or no question, but you can't really say no. It's, I just wanted to know if I could shake your hand before you leave.
Yes. And I hope I get to shake a lot of your hands before I leave. Is it hard retaining your individuality? Yes, it is. And it is hard because you are just bombarded on a almost minute-by-minute basis with all kinds of advice and all sorts of commentary and interpretation. And you just have to continue to ground yourself and be as centered as you can. I remember very well, shortly after my husband was elected governor, I went to an event, and it was one of those events where you were introduced into the room and you had to walk down an aisle, and there were people sitting on both sides. I was walking down the aisle, and out of this ear, I heard somebody say to her friend in a very loud whisper, "I can't stand that dress she's wearing." Then, about 2 feet up, out of my left ear, I heard another woman say to her friend, "Don't you love that dress she's wearing?" And I realized at that moment that that was like the story of your life if you were in this sort of a role, because for all kinds of reasons, people just have a need to analyze you and come up with all sorts of interpretations about you. And if you give into it, you really can begin to pull yourself apart. And I think, again, it's on maybe a bigger, more visible scale as to what happens to friends of mine. I had a friend of mine say to me the other day that she had the best Thanksgiving she ever had because her mother-in-law didn't come. And so she didn't have herself criticized from the moment that you know, the dinner was in the oven until it was cleaned up afterwards. And I thought to myself, that's sort of like the media. I mean, it's like, you know, it's like your mother-in-law coming for Thanksgiving dinner. And I just...
My name's Emily Wolf, and I guess one of the things that we've seen during your husband's and your times in office that community service has been very important. The National Service Trust Act, and just last week seeing you volunteering at SUM. I guess I'm wondering, how do you weigh your role in the White House with your desire to be involved in the community?
That is a wonderful question, and it's one that I have been really thinking hard about for the last several months, because I frankly have gotten a little frustrated and itchy being in the White House, because I feel cut off from people, and I feel that I'm not really out there doing what I care about and making a contribution. I've always been very involved in any community I've ever lived in. I've volunteered in schools, I've volunteered in the hospitals, I have, you know, worked in fund drives. I mean, that is something that I really believe in. And so for the last several months, I've actually been trying to think about how I could be better integrated into my community, which is Washington now, and to get back in touch with what's going on. I mean, there is no substitution for actually being there. You know, when we were standing in the line at SUM, which is So Others May Eat, which is one of the wonderful charities here in Washington that take care of people and feed people, provide medical care and other help, seeing those people go through, I mean, there is no substitution for that kind of personal contact. You know, having them stop and talk to me or the president, being able to talk to the priest who runs it about individuals and having him tell me, well, you know, so-and-so that you just handed the plate to, you know, she's really making progress, getting her life together. I mean, that is personally very important to me, and it's one of the reasons why national service and AmeriCorps is so important to the president. So I am going to get out more. I want to do it in a way that doesn't cause commotion and upset the institutions, and that's one of the reasons why it's taken me longer to figure out how to do it, because I really want to do it as a person and for my own benefit as much as anything, and that's what I'm going to try to figure out how to do.
Mrs. Clinton, I'm David Harvey. I'm the director of the National AIDS Policy Center for Children, Youth, and Families here in Washington. I wanted to ask you just a broad-based question about how you see the future of children's policy, children's health policy for low-income families in the new Congress.
I don't know yet. I am hopeful that the kind of bipartisan support we have always had for children's programs, whether it be Head Start or immunization or WIC, will be there, because I think that those kinds of programs are beyond partisan politics, or at least they should be. I think we do have to face up to the fact that we have an increasing number of poor children. The number of children living in poverty has gone up, unfortunately, in the last several years. And I think we have to confront that and try to figure out the best ways of dealing with all of the issues that surround poor children. And I'm very open to new ways of doing things. I am not wedded to old ways that have not been successful. I'm very interested in approaches that will better deliver services to children, that will better provide support for the families of poor children, that will keep families together. And this is not just an issue for poor children, it's an issue for a lot of our children. I think that, you know, we have really suffered a lot in our country because of the breakup of families at all income levels. But I'm particularly concerned about poor children because they suffer disproportionately from family breakdown and other kinds of challenges. So I think it's too soon to tell what will happen, but I am hopeful that a lot of the issues about providing help for children will go beyond partisan politics. And I intend to do all that I can to speak out for that and to try to raise those issues because I just believe so strongly that we know so much about what helps. And yes, let's figure out better ways of doing it, but let's not turn our backs on children, and particularly poor children who need all the help we can give them so they can grow and be productive citizens, which is what we all want for them.
Is this on? I just wanted to personally thank you for yours and the President's leadership on AIDS issues as well. Just appreciate it.
You know, when people talking about children and the breakup of family and so forth, and the importance in the individual's life of faith, however they define it, however they find it, do you think that it's going to be possible to find a reasonable solution to the issues that are being raised again about prayer in school? Do you think that people on that particular issue will really be able to find some workable solution? Because the President has said he does support it.
Well, the President has said, as he has said for more than 10 years now, that he does support a moment of silence, but he does not support coercive prayer. And I think that there is a way to perhaps allay some of the concerns that people have on all sides of this issue. But I think that prayer and faith start in the family. I think that prayer and faith are the province of the family. And I believe that what we ought to be trying to figure out how to do is to get prayer back in the family. And that is something I believe very strongly in.
Hi, Mrs. Clinton. My name is Amy Sobrad, and I just want to thank you for coming here tonight and tell you how much I respect and admire you. Actually, I think my question has already been answered. I was going to ask you about the future of health care reform and the changing of the Congress, so if you want to speak more to that. I actually work in health care for the Medicaid program, so I can pretty confidently say that a lot of people out there do support it. So if you want to speak to that some more. And also, since I had to kind of think of another question, do you see yourself working on any other policy issues in the next 2 years of, and hopefully 4 after that, of your husband's administration?
Well, I do want to continue to work on behalf of whatever health care reform we're able to achieve through incremental changes that will make life better for the vast majority of Americans by hopefully doing away with pre-existing conditions and making insurance portable and making it possible for families to afford insurance by perhaps buying into one of the programs like Medicaid, which is what's happening in Tennessee, or Medicare, or the Federal Employees Plan. I think there are a lot of creative ideas out there that are going to be kicked around. And the important thing is to focus on what people need. And people need to know that if they have health problems, they're going to be taken care of. And if we keep our focus on that, then I think we can make some changes that will help the vast majority of Americans. Thank you.
Good evening, Mrs. Clinton. My name is Maria Sferaza, and I guess you could say I'm part of the Generation X groupie, or whatever you want to say. My question has to do with how the young people of this country can raise our confidence level up, and how we can make this country in a couple more years, or however long this world will last, just make it happier and more livable.
That's a wonderful question. And it's really an age-old question, I suppose, that every generation has asked itself, but in different conditions. You know, every generation comes to adulthood with its own set of challenges and problems, and sometimes, you know, I think our grandparents and great-grandparents and going back, they had to work so hard just to survive that they didn't have the opportunity to ask themselves about life's meaning or how to make life better. I mean, they were literally just living, you know, day by day, and it's a great burden to be part of a generation of people who have so many of the material questions answered, but then have to think about what you are talking about. How do we really make it better for people and develop more satisfaction? And I think that service is one of the great keys to that. I mean, that's why I'm so strongly supportive of national service and any kind of service. I think people of all ages, but particularly young people, can really learn about themselves as well as make a contribution to their communities and to specific individuals by taking a step out of their own lives, no matter how hectic it may seem, and doing something for other people. I mean, that is part of the way that we all reconnect with what it means to be a human being and to try to make life better for those around us. And at least in my experience, going back all the way to the time I was a teenager and started being involved in service, it has been such an important part of my growing up. And I have never been able to take my own life for granted. I have been really brought up short time and time again. I mean, it's hard to feel sorry for yourself or worry about what anybody's saying about you when you know there are so many needs out there that you could help meet on a one-by-one basis. So I'm very hopeful about your generation. I don't think it's an X generation. I think it's a great big yes generation, and I think there's so much that you can do. And part of the way to build your confidence is to go out there and show yourself what you can do for another person. And that is one of the ways to really understand what it means to be alive. And I hope that you will have a chance to do that.
My name is Mary Neftal, and I'm a retired government worker, but when I worked, we worked on the UN Decade for Women, and Betty Ford was so supportive of the Equal Rights Amendment, and while it didn't pass, are you in favor of the Equal Rights Amendment?
Along with Betty Ford, I proudly say I am.
And Pat Nixon. Pat Nixon was, and Lady Bird, and Mrs. Carter, and Mrs. Bush.
I mean, one of the fascinating things about this series has been really how much alike many of the First Lady's opinions are. I don't think there is any living First Lady who's not pro-choice, for example. And I think that the attitude women have as a result of their experiences may not always be expressed, but it lives in that experience. And so for me, it's a great comfort to know that women like Betty Ford were there long before a lot of these issues were popularized. And when she spoke out, I mean, that was really groundbreaking. And I admire her very much and am very grateful for the help she gave us on health care because she knows a lot about the issues.
In concluding and in thinking about some of the things we've talked about tonight, and also your approach to dealing with the critics and the people who create caricatures and so forth, and your ability to keep going on. I was thinking about a poll, certainly not a pleasant one for you and the President some weeks ago, in which I can't remember the statistics, so I won't quote it, but there were a percentage of people who said they actually hate the Clintons, that it wasn't just disliked or disagreed, that they hate. And I was also thinking about the day Richard Nixon resigned, in his speech in which he said, others may hate you, but if you hate them back, then you destroy yourself. I'm wondering, in just your day-to-day, your going on in this role of First Lady, the wife of the President, how do you manage to just keep going on when people who don't know you burn you in effigy or say they hate you or they protest at a speech? How do you manage to keep going on?
Well, I think a lot about all of the wonderful people whom I know who get up every day and try to love people. And I think that their attitudes about caring for people and taking care of their own families and trying to make a contribution is so much more in line with what I believe, that I just kind of gravitate toward that. And as you said, most of the people who may have those feelings about us don't know us and are getting their impressions from, you know, sources and places that may or may not be accurate. And I think that there is really nothing to be gained in engaging in that kind of feelings that people are exhibiting. I don't think that's really what we're called to do in our own lives as well as in our public life. So I try very hard to, as I said, take it seriously because I don't want people to have the wrong impression. But I can't take it personally. And I think that is what I try to remind myself of every single day. And I also believe that if you're going to try to make a difference in your life, and that's true whether you're working on a community project you care about, if you've got a project at work, if you're committed to anything, you cannot please everybody. And you know, one of the great challenges for us as women is to feel comfortable with the fact we cannot please everybody, that we will do the very best we can. Whether it's Thanksgiving dinner, and I've had some disasters, but I had a great mother-in-law, or whether it's anything else. You just have to be willing to do your very best and then let it go. You cannot brood on it. You cannot worry over it. And so for me, I feel so positive about what my husband's trying to do, and I see the difference that what he's doing is making in people's lives. You know, when somebody comes up and grabs your hand and says, "Thank your husband for family and medical leave because my little girl is dying and I would never have been able to spend time with her," that makes it all worth it, and it makes it so much more real than some poll that says some percentage of people that have never met you, know nothing real about you, have these feelings that, you know, they have. They have to live with that kind of feeling. I'd rather get up every day and think about what I could do, if anything, to try to make life a little better for somebody. And I think you just, if you're really focused on caring about other people, don't have a lot of room for hate in your life. And so that's what I hope we all decide.
Thank you. We have a little gift for you.
Thank you all.
Most visibly as head of the Healthcare Task Force. But she has also gracefully fulfilled traditional First Lady social, hostess, and entertainment responsibilities. As she travels across the nation and around the globe, Hillary Clinton represents this administration and the American people with energy and eloquence. Hillary and President Clinton came to the White House with one of the most ambitious agendas of our lifetime, a commitment to and a vision of a better America. They have never wavered, despite an immense amount of personal and professional criticism, demonstrating, perhaps, that change is one of the most traumatic experiences that a nation can undergo. People prefer the devil they know to the angel they don't, and will remain loyal to the status quo ante, avoiding risk, even when the potential gain is quite extraordinary. In the face of all this, Hillary Clinton has put aside the safe choices in an effort to stake out a 21st century that will be a fairer and better place for all Americans. On behalf of the George Washington University community, it is a tremendous pleasure and an honor to host this evening a woman of remarkable achievement, a woman of many talents, whose intelligence, spirit, and dedication I greatly admire. And now, before we greet the First Lady of the United States, please welcome your instructor, Carl Sferrazza Anthony.
She refused to talk to the press and protected her only daughter, her only child, a teenager, from public exposure. She also advised her husband to drop the atomic bomb. Her name was Bess Truman. She always used her maiden name, worked full-time, managed the family investments, and declared that a day would come in America when husbands and wives both worked, and that it would be no shame if the wife was the breadwinner. Her name, Florence Kling Harding. She believed that women should be provided with as thorough an education as men and were discriminated against by state and federal law and would eventually organize to demand equality. More partisan than her husband, the other political party parried her as Mrs. President. That was 197 years ago. It was Abigail Adams.
Good evening. Sound check. Good evening. It is a pleasure to be here this evening to join all of you, students, faculty, and distinguished guests, for this very special session of the President's Spouse. My name is Francine Zorn-Trachtenberg, and in my capacity as the spouse of the President of the George Washington University, I have the honor to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Since the inauguration of President Clinton in January 1992, Hillary Rodham Clinton has been a frequent visitor to the George Washington University campus. Over a year ago, Mrs. Clinton spoke to a group of state and municipal legislators about the administration's health care reform plan. This fall, she addressed the GW campus medical community in recognition of National Primary Care Day, and that was the very same week she accompanied Mrs. Yeltsin to campus to celebrate music with Van Cliburn. Last May, our graduating students witnessed Mrs. Clinton receiving an honorary Doctor of Public Service degree at GW's graduation exercises and heard her deliver remarks at the commencement ceremonies held on the Ellipse, the Clintons' backyard. The honorary degree was granted in recognition of Mrs. Clinton's many years of commitment to public life, which, as we all know, began long before she came to Washington. For 12 years, Hillary Clinton was the First Lady of Arkansas. In that capacity, she won great respect for her efforts on behalf of children and families. She chaired the Arkansas Education Standards Committee. She founded the Arkansas Advocates for Children and Families, served on the board of the Children's Hospital, and pioneered a new program called Arkansas Home Instruction Program, an enterprise that trains parents to work with their children in preschool preparedness and literacy. On the national front, she was a member of the board of Marion Wright Edelman's Children Defense Fund, based here in Washington. During those hectic years, Hillary Rodham Clinton also found time to work as a full-time partner of a law firm, manage and oversee an official residence, and care for her family. Activities accomplished through a balancing act all too familiar to many women here tonight. She has brought that gift of balance to the White House. Not only has Mrs. Clinton taken on critically important civic responsibilities,
she advised her husband on cabinet appointments and dismissals, and when scandal threatened to engulf his presidency, she worked behind the scenes to go public with everything and move on. Remember Nancy Reagan? She was appointed by the president to head an official task force, testified before Congress, and it took 3 long years before her Mental Health Systems Act became law. Rosalind Carter saw it through. Congress finally passed Ellen Wilson's Alley Dwelling Act when she was only on her deathbed. Sarah Polk, sought out for her views by House and Senate leaders, kept her office in the president's executive suite. Earning the highest level of education for a first lady at that time, Lucy Hayes was hailed as a symbol of the new woman. All of which should prove one thing. Intelligent and active first ladies, besides Eleanor Roosevelt, are as part of as rich and ancient an American tradition as Independence Day. The current First Lady is not Eleanor Roosevelt incarnate, or Abigail Adams, or anybody else. She is, like all before her, a distinct individual. She is Hillary Rodham Clinton. Today, it is swifter and slicker to sell something by labeling people with one characteristic, then forever typecast them in that caricature. If some other facet of who they really are emerges but doesn't conform to the cliche, it is usually ignored. Every one of us can be categorized by labels: race, religion, gender, income, education, age, political affiliation, hair color. But everyone demands the right not to be reduced to a label. It is the unique combination of everyone's list of labels that shapes them as a distinct individual. Hillary Clinton has many labels: Midwestern, born after World War II, college-educated, traditional Methodist, wife and mother, lawyer, public interest advocate, hostess, only daughter, eldest child, blonde. And it takes less effort to reduce her, uncomplicated, by one or another label, but never all of them at the same time. In most cases, the exploitation of Mrs. Clinton as a symbol by liberal sycophants and conservative hate-mongers alike not only distorts but obliterates who she is as a full person. Standard Committee, a founder of the Arkansas Home Instruction Program for preschool youngsters, chair of the Children's Defense Fund, full-time hostess in the traditional role of Arkansas's First Lady, and, as of 1980, mother to Chelsea Victoria. Her years as First Lady of Arkansas served her well when she became First Lady of the United States and chose to play a variety of public roles. Within 3 weeks of the inauguration, President Clinton asked her to head his health care task force to draft health care reform. The First Lady became a familiar sight on Capitol Hill, and while improvement of the situation didn't immediately emerge from Congress, Hillary Clinton inaugurated the first full national dialogue in history on the complex problem of health care. And she continues, like many First Ladies before her, to serve as an informal sounding board to her husband. Hillary Clinton has continued the public traditional role begun by Dolly Madison, from christening ships to cutting ribbons to greeting groups in the White House to traveling with the president, planning menus, entertainment, and social events. And like Edith Roosevelt, Lucretia Garfield, she has fiercely guarded time for her teenage daughter in the White House and sought to protect her from the media's glare. And like younger women, Jacqueline Kennedy, Julia Tyler, Frances Cleveland, she is an endless source of fashion speculation. Two of the many labels that can be applied to the First Lady are illustrated in tonight's film clips. The first shows her opening congressional testimony on health care. The second, her press remarks on planning the recent state dinner for Nelson Mandela. We'll go to those now.
During the past months, as I have worked to educate myself about the problems facing our nation and facing American citizens about health care, I have learned a great deal. The official reason I am here today is because I have had that responsibility. But more importantly for me, I'm here as a mother, a wife, a daughter, a sister, a woman. I'm here as an American citizen, concerned about the health of her family and the health of her nation. Like so many Americans, I have seen firsthand the strengths of our healthcare system as well as its frailties. I know what it's like to be overwhelmed with forms and regulations and confusing medical choices when a family member is dying. I know the anguish that comes when it is impossible to weigh choices or make rational.
While she set precedents that have been followed precedents that were set by her predecessors, there truly has never been a president's spouse with Mrs. Clinton's background and experience. She is the first First Lady born in that new generation that did not know Franklin Delano Roosevelt as president as a young woman. Remember, the gap between her and the youngest of her predecessors at the time of the Clinton inaugural, Jacqueline Kennedy, was 17 years. She was born in Illinois in 1947, daughter of a conservative Republican, self-employed businessman, raised in a home where the names Roosevelt and Kennedy were not beloved, as she recalls in this month's American Heritage. Her father's influence on her was strong, and in high school in 1964, she was a Goldwater girl, supporting the conservative presidential candidate who ran against LBJ. Although, of course, she did change political parties later, it was the beginning of her political activism. Religion also influenced her. Raised to believe that her social responsibility lay not only within her family circle, but the larger family, her community, she was guided by her Methodist youth counselor to help the disadvantaged, from inner-city Chicago children to the children of Mexican migrant workers. As part of her youth group, she heard Martin Luther King speak in Chicago. His 1968 assassination, said a friend of Hillary's, more than anything, firmed her resolve to do her utmost to stop injustice. She excelled not only in school, but was active in student government, coming of an age at a time when young women were encouraged to pursue the more available choices to them. She graduated from Wellesley in 1969 as college government president, delivering a speech which was covered by Life magazine. At the age of 21 years old, Miss Rodham was a public figure in her own right. The first First Lady to have also earned a graduate degree, she attended Yale Law School, where she met her future husband. After marrying Bill Clinton and moving to Arkansas, she taught law at the State University. As he pursued a political career, she not only played the traditional role of political wife in his campaigns for Attorney General and later governor, but pursued her professional career in law. As the governor's wife from 1979 to 1981, and then again from 1983 to 1993, she assumed multiple tasks, as Mrs. Trachtenberg indicated, chair of the Education